coming up, it's hard to imagine a world without plastic, but it's become a real danger for the planet. We look at what plastic's made from, how it impacts the world around us, and why we just can't seem to get rid of it.
Do you get a sense the issue of plastic exports is just a situation of wealthier nations trying to evade their own climate responsibilities?
Absolutely.
And we talk about solving our plastics pollution problem after 170 countries argued over a serious, legally binding treaty. We use so much of it in our life. There's plastic behind you. There's plastic in our studio here.
We are consuming and producing so much more plastic than we can handle.
This is Just 2 Degrees on TRT World. As a material, plastic has changed the course of human history, influencing and aiding in technological developments. But there's too much of it. As it piles up, nations are grappling with the problem of getting rid of it. Sarah tells us why.
Plastic is a type of material made via a chemical reaction and can be shaped or molded using heat and pressure. It's synthetic, meaning it's not made of molecules found in nature, and lightweight, durable, flexible, and cheap to produce. It can be made into a wide variety of colors, shapes, textures, and sizes. It has countless applications, and since its invention around 100 years ago, it's had a major impact on human life. The first fully synthetic plastic was known as Bakelite. It was used for baking pans and crockery, doorknobs, car parts, and more. It was heat-resistant, strong, and ideal for mass production. World War II expanded plastic use by 300%, according to the Science History Institute. Plastic-based fabric called nylon was used to make parachutes, rope, and more. Plastic known as plexiglass replaced glass in aircraft windows. After the war, plastics increasingly replaced existing materials: steel in car parts, paper and glass in packaging, wood in furniture. It made computers, cell phones, and many life-saving medical advances possible. A consumer boom after the 1970s came with another increase in the use of plastics, but as early as the first sightings of plastic in the ocean in the 1960s, the problem of waste began to trouble many who'd begun to grow anxious about pollution and other dangers to the environment. Plastic's reputation as a miracle material started to fade when the focus began to shift from how it can be used to the problem of how it can be disposed of, and it's quickly become a crisis.
These plastics wash upon our shores, threaten the livelihoods of our people, hinder our tourism and fisheries industries, among others, and suffocate our ecosystems.
The first issue is it takes plastic a long time to break down. That means most of the plastic that's ever been made still exists and ends up in the environment. Another issue is how we use it. It's mass-produced, cheap, and easy to throw away, especially single-use plastics like cigarette butt filters, food wrappers, bottle caps, straws, and grocery bags. Burying plastic is a problem because it can release harmful chemicals into soil and contaminate water and the ecosystem, harming humans and wildlife. Burning plastic releases toxic chemicals that pollute air, also harming humans and animals. Space in landfills is limited, and much plastic waste ends up in the ocean, collecting in spots like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a more than 1.5 million square kilometer expanse of trash floating in the Pacific Ocean. In the ocean, plastic can harm marine life or break down into microplastic particles that also find their way into fish and humans.
Sí, es otra evidencia más de toda esa basura, ese distinto tipo de contaminación que lamentablemente está en el mar, que nosotros no podemos percibir, no podemos ver, y que sin embargo estas criaturas, como el caso de este lobito, nos llama, digamos, nos traen a cuenta.
We still produce around 400 million tons of plastic waste each year. That's forecast to reach 1,100 million tons by 2050. Without a serious solution to the problem by then, the UN predicts we'll end up seeing more plastic in our seas than fish. And recycling isn't widespread enough to handle how much plastic we produce, use, and throw away. The UN reports that so far, globally, humans have created 7 billion tons of plastic waste, and less than 10% of it has been recycled.
The truth is that we cannot recycle our way out of this mess. Recycling infrastructure is unable to... Thank you. Recycling infrastructure is unable to cope with today's volumes.
So plastic bags, straws, and the like are dangerous if ingested by animals or us. But the danger goes far beyond that. A new study by researchers from the University of Hawaii has found that greenhouse gases, specifically methane and ethylene, are emitted from 7 of the most commonly used plastics.
Mass production of these has been booming since 1950s. They are non-biodegradable, and that means all plastic that has ever been produced is still with us in one way or another.
Plastic waste is a serious menace, especially in the developing countries. For us to be able to effectively manage this waste, we must think of how best can we reduce, how can we reuse, and how can we recycle. It's even better when we tap into the potential that come with technology and we are able to recycle plastic and come up with so many other things that can be usable in our day-to-day lives. Talk of posts, talk of seats, and several other things that can come from recycling of plastics.
Plastic takes between 20 to 500 years to decompose, and that's depending on the material structure and environmental factors such as exposure to sunlight. Plastic bags are usually made out of polythene, a tough, light, flexible synthetic which takes at least 20 years to break down. While for coffee lovers, your cups take 30 years. Plastic bottles are made out of material that's hard for bacteria to break down, and they require at least 450 years to fully decompose. Disposable diapers and toothbrushes are made out of polypropylene plastic and nylon and can take up to 500 years or more to decompose. When larger pieces of plastic break down into smaller pieces, they eventually reduce to microplastic particles. More than 10 million tons of it ends up in our ocean every year and then eaten by fish and other marine life.
There are studies showing that there's microplastics in our air, in our water, and in our bodies as well. And that's just one facet of the problem. If you go into the communities where plastic production happens, they're already suffering from very serious health risks and health conditions because of emissions, of contamination from these plastic production facilities.
But there is some good news. Scientists at the University of Texas have made a breakthrough discovery. Using a process called depolymerization, they have created an enzyme that can degrade plastics in days. The fast-acting protein breaks down synthetic used in fibers for clothing and plastic, responsible for 12% of global waste. It's a step in the right direction, but not yet enough to alter the current environmental trajectory we are on. Dominic Brian Omondi, Just 2 Degrees.
Scientists are butting heads over what should be done with all our plastic waste. Some countries have decided that getting rid of it is a simple matter of shipping it off to another place. But that doesn't get rid of the waste. This report was written and produced by Just 2 Degrees producer Betul Uluturk.
Exporting plastic waste is a cheaper alternative for countries keen on managing their emissions and reduces pressure on local landfills and recycling facilities. Importing plastics, on the other hand, has some financial benefits. Producing goods from recycled plastic is cheaper than buying newly manufactured ones. The UN says if the global plastic trades were a country, it would be the 4th largest exporter. According to a study published in the Journal of World Systems Research, higher plastic waste imports have positive impacts on the economic growth of many low-income countries. But prioritizing monetary gain over the environment can come at a higher cost to precious ecosystems. In 2021, a staggering 369 million tons of plastic was exported, equivalent to a queue of waste trucks wrapped around the globe 13 times. Germany leads the world in plastic scraps and waste exports. In 2020, Berlin shipped a massive 854 million kilograms of plastic waste to countries like the Netherlands, Turkey, Austria, Switzerland, and Malaysia. In the same year, Japan shipped 821 million kilograms of plastic waste, mostly to Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and South Korea. And the US exported more than 600 million kilograms of plastic waste in 2020. The majority of it was sent to Canada, the rest to Mexico, Malaysia, Vietnam, India, Hong Kong, and Indonesia. Low-income countries, in effect, accept the bulk of the world's plastic waste. But at what cost? Chile has so much foreign waste piled up in the country's Atacama Desert that it can be seen from space. There are mountains of discarded clothing here, a graveyard of shoes, and rows of scrap tires.
Sentimos abandonados, sentimos que nuestra tierra se ha transformado en una zona de sacrificio finalmente. Pero insisto, son los inescrupulosos del mundo que vienen a botar su basura acá. Es como el patio trasero, ya ni siquiera somos el patio trasero local, sino que somos el patio trasero del mundo, que es peor. O sea, no hay conciencia todavía para poder resolver este problema, por el contrario, ¿no?
China, to prevent itself from becoming a dump for global waste, implemented bans on 24 types of recyclable waste in 2018. As a result, their plastic waste imports decreased by more than 95% within a year. Beijing's decision spiked waste imports in other Asian nations, sparking limitations in the region and beyond. In 2019, Malaysia and the Philippines returned tons of rubbish to their original owners, including Canada, the UK, the US, and France. They say it was falsely labeled as plastic waste or was not recyclable. And Thailand announced it will ban all plastic waste imports by 2025 in a 3-staged plan. And 187 countries have signed a global treaty called the Basel Convention, which aims to regulate the cross-border movement and disposal of hazardous waste. Céline Tutar, just 2 degrees.
We hear a lot more about plastic, microplastics these days, and the idea that much of it is floating about in the air or ingested by, say, marine animals, which we then consume. But is this tiny substance in our system a real concern?
Yes, it is. Certain elements of plastic production, chemicals that go into its production, and plastics are known to be endocrine disruptors, so affecting the very basic building blocks of our biological systems. And they are, as you say, absolutely everywhere. There are many effects that we don't fully understand about the impact of microplastics on us as organisms and on other organisms. To give one example, a recent study in the UK suggested that soil is effectively now toxic due to its impregnation with microplastics. This actually led to one tabloid saying, if you're going to go out into your garden, you'd better wear a mask because it's essentially now dangerous to have contact with soil. So I would argue that the danger of their ubiquity is pretty clear.
According to the World Economic Forum, around 350 million metric tons of plastic waste are produced on a yearly basis. About 2% of that is traded. And researchers say that higher plastic waste imports positively impact the economic growth of low-income countries. But Ed, do you get the sense a country like, say, Malaysia, which might be the world's top waste importer, can handle so much plastic without it having a negative impact on the local environment?
In a word, no. The countries that import the most waste, which are South Asian countries, like you mentioned, like South Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, are also countries that have a certain plastic capacity for recycling and for waste disposal. We know from the amounts exported to them that the amount of plastic going there greatly exceeds that capacity. That means for sure that a lot of that plastic is not being recycled. So whatever the impacts may be positively on the local economy, there are terrible impacts on the local environment. And essentially what's happening is countries like the UK, Australia, the USA are exporting huge amounts of their plastic waste. And it's kind of like if you imagine if you and I lived in the same house, and when I finish with my dinner and I have my plastic tray, this was my dinner last night, right? And I do try to avoid these kinds of plastics, but I like the idea of having a prop today. But imagine if when I finished with this, I just came into your room and chucked it into your room. That's really what the big countries are doing with these smaller countries right now.
Yeah, someone gave me the term waste colonialism at one point in time. Do you get a sense the issue of plastic exports is just a situation of wealthier nations trying to evade their own climate responsibilities and protect their own ecosystems by shipping off their plastic waste?
Absolutely. The amount of plastic production per capita is way bigger in certain Western countries that have a very large amount of economic clout, particularly the UK, Australia, and the USA. And those are the countries which are trying to export their waste problem. But there isn't really the capacity to deal with that waste in the countries that they're exporting to.
What are your thoughts on the potential success of a plastics treaty, which I believe will be considered or talked about a lot more later this year?
Absolutely. So the Global Plastics Treaty is the UN treaty which will be decided by the end of 2024. It's going to set policy for UN countries on plastic potentially for decades to come. So it's incredibly important. The outcome hangs in the balance right now, and the question is who is going to set those kinds of policy, because at the talks you have countries that produce large amounts of oil and gas, you have chemical company associations, and you have people who would like to convince us that plastic can be part of a circular economy, right, where plastic is kind of moving around from point of production through disposal back towards reproduction again. On the other hand, we have those of us who say we need to follow the waste reduction hierarchy. First of all, we need to reduce the amount of plastic we use. Then we need to seriously introduce reuse systems. And as a last resort, we recycle. So many of us don't believe that recycling is really a good solution. It just perpetuates the waste problem. That idea of a circle for plastic, it doesn't really make sense, right? If you think about my little prop again from my dinner last night, imagine this beginning its life in the North Sea, in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, as essentially oil in the ground, being extracted, being broken down into its basic building blocks, being turned into a polymer in a reactor, and then being injection molded to make this one item for me, the consumer at this end in the UK, so that I can have my dinner. And then after that, when I'm done with this, and I've only used it once for my one meal, this piece of plastic then has to go further to be picked up, sorted, cleaned, and then broken back down into those component building blocks. The argument of the petrochemical companies and of some countries who want to perpetuate a plastic industry where we're producing huge amounts of waste is that that forms a nice circle. But as you can see, it's a circle with loads of different energy processes coming off it at all points.
I'm sure you didn't need all these reports from us to tell you how dangerous plastics are for us and the environment. But the gravity of the situation needs reiteration, and many countries are rising to the challenge to tackle plastic pollution. The recent UN talks in Paris saw 170 nations agree to develop the first draft of what could be the first global treaty to tackle the problem. But there's still much debate over what the solution will look like. Marco Lambertini is back with us on Just 2 Degrees. He's a WWF special envoy and no stranger to the show. Marco, it's always a pleasure seeing you.
Likewise. Thank you.
What's your initial reaction to the week of negotiations in Paris?
Well, look, this is a complex issue. And actually, at the beginning, we were quite worried because the negotiations started very slowly. There was a lot of emphasis on rules, procedures. Half of the week of the negotiation was occupied by that kind of more administrative discussion. But then in the second half, we really started to talk about the content. And actually, as you mentioned, over 170, almost 180 countries were present in attendance at the meeting. So that means that there is a strong attention to the issue. And 135 countries really were expressed their opinion. They were in favor of strong binding global rules. And also there is already a high ambition coalition of more than 50 countries pushing for strong targets on a number of ways to curb plastic pollution. So at the end, the meeting was successful, I would say, particularly also because they agreed to now draft an initial text of the treaty that will become the main focus for intersessional discussions, but also for the negotiations, the next round, the third round of negotiations in Nairobi in November.
That's great. As you mentioned, there's strong will to come to an agreement on plastics. And all these 170 countries obviously have an interest in pursuing that. But there were procedural issues delegates argued over in the first half of the talks. What were they about?
Well, they were mainly about the way the group will make decisions, which was obviously an important topic. But actually, these were already been agreed provisionally earlier on in the previous negotiation. And so we all thought this was going to be just ratified and agreed as previously done. But no, there were a lot of comments about changing the rules again, going back. And the real issue was, how do we agree? Do we require consensus, or do we actually go to a vote of majority? And obviously, as you can imagine, consensus will allow one single country to block any agreement, while vote by majority will guarantee a much stronger, perhaps more democratic outcome. Anyway, this was the substance of the discussion. There was no final conclusion and agreement, but we hope this discussion will not continue and actually and affect the third round of negotiations.
Marco, this is a really tough issue, isn't it? I mean, plastics, we use so much of it in our life. There's plastic behind you. There's plastic in our studio here. We wear things with plastic in it. What are the actual aims of the treaty, and how do they expect to implement all this?
First of all, you said that in your opening, the issue started years ago, decades ago, as a kind of aesthetic problem, right? It was ugly to see plastic in the environment, on the street, in the rivers, in the ocean, on the beach. Now we know, because of the escalation of the production and consumption, because we are leaking in the ocean every year 40 million tons of plastic, one truck every minute, the issue has become actually an issue that affects the environment, marine wildlife, fisheries, and ultimately ourselves. Because now we discover the microplastic, the plastic that fragments and becomes very tiny, enters the food chain, particularly in the ocean. We eat it with the food, with fish. We drink it in the water because it's even pervaded source of potable, drinkable water, and we breathe it with the air that we breathe every day. So this microplastic in our bodies now is known to enter the bloodstream, enter the brains, and enter the placenta. And that's an additional element of concern. So the aim on the treaty, to your question, is to really put in place global rules, global standards, because plastic is a global problem. Plastic goes around the world through currents, through wind, everywhere, rivers, the ocean. So global rules, global standards are able to actually reduce the leakage of plastic in the environment and ultimately affect our own health. Actually, the vision for the treaty should really be zero plastic in nature. And to do that, we need to reduce the consumption and production. We are consuming and producing so much more plastic than we can handle. And that's why that becomes pollution, goes into the rivers and the ocean. That's why we are recycling only 10% globally of plastic. So we need to reduce the unnecessary plastic. There's plenty of unnecessary plastic. And then we need to tackle the harmful plastic, particularly single-use, which is the one that goes more easily into the environment, microplastic, particularly ready-made microplastic. We have microplastic in paints, in toothpaste, in body care products. Tires produce, car tires, a lot of microplastic. We need to try to curb microplastic as a second category of harmful plastic. And then the third one is fishing gears. So we don't talk much about that, but actually a lot of nets, a lot of lines, plastic made, are actually abandoned in the ocean. They're killing marine life. They are affecting fishing industry. And that is another dimension that needs to be tackled by the treaty.
Surely this is a topic we will be revisiting a lot in the future. Marco, always a pleasure having you on Just 2 Degrees. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, I hope what you've seen and heard in this episode helps you see the impact plastics have on the planet. We, after all, are the ultimate drivers of plastic production. And the global shift in consumption patterns won't be easy or comfortable. But for now, here are a few simple things you can do to reduce your plastic footprint. Buy a reusable shopping bag instead of single-use plastic bags. Purchase rice, pasta and cereals in bulk. And get a reusable coffee cup and water bottle. Utilize recycle bins that separate paper, plastic and organic material. Not everyone uses them correctly, which makes it a tad more difficult for recycle centres to do their work. But as much as you can, throw plastics in the plastic compartment, paper where it should go, and so on. And take part in community cleanups. They are a great way to prevent plastics from ending up in the ocean and killing marine life. That's how we end this episode of Just 2 Degrees. Before we leave you, the residents of the Indian towns of Shimla and Dharamsala say they're facing an environmental threat from foreigners. Take a look at this litter. Plastic wrappers, bottles and packets have all become common sights in this hilly region, which every year receives an overwhelming number of tourists. They may help the local economy when they arrive, but they leave tons of garbage when they go. Hope to see you next time. Bye.